Welcome back. If you're studying a humanities degree or are simply just interested in history, politics, economics, or even just human nature, then this video is made for you. Here are 6 really great books that I think you need to know, whether you're going to read them for fun or use them in your personal statement for uni. Let's get directly into why each of these deserves a place on your bookshelf. So we're going to start off with The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers by Paul Kennedy, which is an international bestseller that explores why global powers emerge, flourish, and eventually collapse. Kennedy basically condenses 500 years worth of data from GDP growth, defense budgets, and naval tonnage, which is basically the capacity of a ship. And these statistics show how money actually becomes military power, seen in a lot of examples of empires in the world. And by empires, Kennedy covers a lot, from Habsburg Spain in the 1500s, France and the Dutch Republic in the 1600s, Britain's long-running maritime ascendancy in the 1700s, Germany's credit finance surge in the 1800s, and America post-World War II, amongst some others. Kennedy's real work, in my opinion, is weaving economics, strategy, and politics into one story. So just showing clearly that all these little influences kind of play together. And he spots a clear cycle. When a state overspends on armies and empires, or as he calls it, imperial overstretch, it ultimately erodes its own economy and sets itself on the path to decline. But I'll leave you to read more on that later. A neat little story Kennedy slips into chapter 3 comes from the middle of the 7 Years' War. The French foreign minister, watching British warships strangle French trade, admitted that it was colonies and sea power that really decided who ruled Europe. Even Britain's enemy could see it. London's knack for turning commercial wealth into naval muscle and then into subsidies and cash for its allies was what really tipped the scales for Britain to be a global empire, and it's bits like this that make up his story. But from a reading perspective, Kennedy's writing is compelling. It's historically meticulous for those who love to read small details, but perhaps it isn't as accessible as a starter book because it is very data heavy and very description heavy. You can get historical context, but also a basic understanding of contemporary geopolitics and why the world is the world it is today. And this is great, especially if you're a student or new to the subject, because it encourages you to draw parallels between parts of history that may initially seem distant. But whilst Kennedy tracks who wins wars by counting coal, capital, and weapons, he gives very limited attention to the soft variables, like ideology, culture, social cohesion, leadership choices, that significantly decide whether a state can actually mobilize the resources it already has. And if you're wondering how these soft variables rig the game before the first shot is even fired, the next book on our list, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, picks up exactly before Kennedy begins. Diamond's Pulitzer Prize-winning book is a similar exploration into why certain countries and empires achieve global dominance over others. And I like it because it's very interdisciplinary and it's filled with a lot of anecdotes and stories about world history. He adds the story of the 1532 collision at... Let me Google how to pronounce this.
Welcome to How to Pronounce. In today's video, we'll be focusing on a new word that you might find challenging or intriguing.
Cajamarca.
Okay, forgive my pronunciation. He adds a story of the 1532 collision at Cajamarca, where less than 200 Spaniards ambushed and captured the Inca emperor after torturing information out of Inca warriors. An army of tens of thousands of Incas melts before guns, horses, and late medieval weapons. And this huge moment powers Diamond's core question. Why did some societies get the lethal weapons first? And I think the strength of his answer is this integration of anthropology, geography, biology, and history, which come together to say that geographic advantages, not racial or cultural differences, largely determine the fate of civilization. So in his view, it wasn't due to particular European intellect as to why many European empires dominated over others, but rather how empires shaped agriculture, disease, and tech innovation. Britain had a surplus of coal. Coal is essential in the steam engine, making steamships to travel across the world. And this ultimately led to some societies to luckily dominate over others, rather than due to an unfair intellectual advantage. But anyway, Diamond's writing is highly accessible. He synthesizes complex theories into a very clear narrative, making sophisticated arguments much easier to understand. I think it's a particularly great starter book. But while Diamond shows how geography sowed the first seeds of unequal development, our next book, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, picks up the story by charting how accumulated wealth can hardwire inequality over time. In a very short summary, Piketty provides a detailed analysis on wealth distribution, and he argues that capitalist systems, if left unchecked, will naturally lead to rising inequality. He heavily uses methodical research and vast economic data, which makes this a great read for those leaning more towards evidence-based arguments over pure theory. And at the heart of Piketty's book lies a deceptively simple formula: R over G, where R is the average rate of return on capital. Think dividends, interest, rent, while G is the overall growth rate of the economy. So GDP. So the equation means the return on capital for those who already own assets tends to exceed the country's overall economic growth, inherently deepening inequality. Over generations, this gap drives a feedback loop. Capital begets more capital, widening the chasm between a small property-owning elite and everyone else. And it's good to realize that this isn't just a statistic. It's a lens on centuries of human stories. You can trace how 19th century landowners, early industrial magnates, and today's tech sector investors all ride that same wave. Here's an example straight from Piketty's work. He notes that of the Forbes 400 richest Americans in 1987, 327 had dropped off the list by 2013, underlining just how churning, even at the top, wealth can be. It shows you not just how capitalism works in theory, but also how it has played across in history. But as powerful as his R over G narrative is, Piketty looks less deeply into the political and ideological battles over tax, regulation, and property rights that actually shape those capital flows. That gap in political analysis is exactly what our next read, Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, dives into, showing how the very policies meant to tame inequality can actually threaten individual freedom. The Road to Serfdom is a landmark political and economic critique written during the turmoil of World War II. Hayek argues passionately against the dangers of centralized planning, in that once you hand the state the power to direct economic activity, to decide what's produced, how it's produced, who gets what, you inevitably undermine the very liberties that democracy is meant to protect. To enforce their plans, governments must suppress debate, limit free speech, and concentrate power in ever larger administrative bodies. In Hayek's view, even the most benevolent planner faces a choice: either tolerate inefficiency, or, more likely, crush individual freedom to achieve efficiency. Over time, this dynamic transforms a free society into something resembling serfdom. Citizens become cogs in a machine they neither understand nor control. What makes Hayek's writing impactful, in my opinion, is that he gives the reader a sense that he's considered the alternatives, without necessarily offending those who disagree. So he mentions clearly how even well or good-intentioned economic centralization could unintentionally pave the way towards authoritarianism. In the 1945 British election, Winston Churchill famously warned that a Labour victory would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, perhaps following Hayek's argument. The Conservative Central Office gave up 1.5 tons of its paper ration just to print out copies of Hayek's book, and they still lost the vote, which shows just how powerful Hayek's warnings felt amid wartime rationing and post-war reconstruction. It's a vivid illustration of his core claim. Once you hand the state coercive economic power, the line between planning for prosperity and planning for control can vanish overnight. But this book is great because it links economics with political freedom, encouraging you to question the balance between government power and individual rights, and how these are key motivations in modern-day struggles. You can also connect these ideas to things you read in the news, whether you want a paternalistic country that prioritizes safety and control over personal liberty. These are debates that are still ongoing constantly and consistently, and a book like this kind of gives you a better insight into why. We're going to take a break from politics now to zoom out and ask, how did we ever build those political and economic systems in the first place? That's where Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens comes in. By tracing the cognitive revolution, when our ancestors began weaving shared myths and imagined orders, Harari shows how cooperation on a massive scale first became possible. Sapiens reveals the deeper human impulses that created power structures to begin with. I know a lot of people have already read this book, but Harari's Sapiens, in my opinion, pulls off a rare feat. It delivers the big picture history from the cognitive revolution tens of thousands of years ago, right until today, whilst never losing sight of the real human stories at its heart. It's a very interdisciplinary book, so anthropology, psychology, philosophy, history, you'll find elements of all of those disciplines within this one narrative. The main theme is that Homo sapiens' dominance emerges not only as a byproduct of their physical abilities, but also from our ability to have a shared collective imagination. Our shared myths, beliefs, narratives such as religion, nations, laws, and even money lets millions of people cooperate in a way that no other species can. But also in the chapter on the agricultural revolution, Harari flips the script and calls wheat the real dominator. Rather than humans taming wheat, he argues that wheat domesticated us, tricking Homo sapiens into breaking our backs, sowing and harvesting so that the wheat could spread its DNA. It's a clever twist on evolutionary success. One crop strategy literally reshaped our societies and our bodies. In this way, Sapiens encourages you to think a little further about the underlying forces that shape human behavior and societal structures. That question leads us to our next and final book, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. You might have already heard that The Wealth of Nations is basically the original playbook for modern economies. Part philosophy, part history, part policy manual. I will be honest with you that this is not the most accessible read, but there are some great alternatives or summaries of Adam Smith's work that are available on the internet, and I will put one down below in the bio. At its core is the idea of the invisible hand, where each person, by pursuing their own self-interest, inadvertently promotes the public good through market exchanges. And Smith is already very well known for his ideas on the division of labour and advocating for minimal government intervention, kind of similar to Hayek's ideas, but I'll leave you to read up on those before I reveal the whole book. Actually, I like explaining the division of labour stuff. Basically, his example uses a pin factory. One worker working in a pin factory, doing each step of the process, might take hours to make maybe 1,000 pins. But you divide the labour up. You have 10 workers, each assigned to a single post, making a single part of the pin. In the same amount of time it takes that one worker to make 1,000, the 10 workers might make tens of thousands of pins. It's a simple scene and a very simple example, but it does this well. It shows how specialization can actually increase productivity and, in the end, increase wealth. But anyway, for a humanities student, Smith does more than just lay out supply and demand curves. He teaches you to read economic history as a web of ideas and incentives. You learn how to spot how moral philosophy underpins economic behavior, appreciate the historical evolution of markets, but fundamentally, you can learn to critically assess both the promises and the pitfalls of capitalism. We can kind of see parallels to this in Thomas Piketty's book, as I mentioned earlier, where he talks about the pitfalls of capitalism. And in this book, maybe you can find some positives. And with that, we've covered our 6 essential reads. I think that each of these books absolutely equips you with a better understanding of the world. As a humanities student or someone interested in these subjects, your greatest strength lies in asking meaningful questions. Anyway, which book intrigued you the most? Do you have any other recommendations? I would love to read them, so please put them down in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe. See you next time!